How do you lose the body of a king, and how do you find it again? This is the story of what happened to Richard III's corpse, from the moment he was horribly butchered to death, to the appalling post-mortem treatment his body received, to his original burial and 15th century monument, all the way through to how his remains were lost for centuries, and the outlandish stories about what had been done with his bones. I'll then discuss the extraordinary rediscovery of his skeleton under a car park in 2012, review what his bones have revealed to us about the last Plantagenet King of England, and explain the controversies and legal actions that resulted from his unexpected reappearance, from arguments over where he should be reburied to disputes over who should have credit for finding him, which have even been played out in a Hollywood movie. It's a roller coaster tale, so sit back and enjoy one of the most famous lost and found stories of the modern age. Richard III, last monarch of the Yorkist branch of the Plantagenet family, famously died at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485 at the age of 32, having lost his life and his crown to the forces of Henry Tudor, formerly the Earl of Richmond and now King Henry VII. Richard is of course famous for having supposedly had his nephews, the so-called princes in the Tower, murdered in 1483 so that he could become king, but it is not that episode, or his life in general, with which this video is concerned. I have videos looking at the fate of the princes, which I'll leave linked below for you. But today we're beginning at the end, for our starting point is Richard's death. We have several accounts of how he died, and they vary both in the level of detail they provide and in their reliability. A proclamation made by Henry VII shortly after becoming king said only that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, late called King Richard, was slain at a place called Sandford within the shire of Leicester, and brought dead off the field unto the town of Leicester, and there was laid openly, that every man might see and look upon him. The contemporary English writer John Roos, who had been pro-Yorkist but who finished his history of the Kingdom of England in 1486, shortly after Richard's death, said nothing of the post-mortem treatment of the body, recording only that he, quote, at last was buried in the choir of the Friars Minor at Leicester. Perhaps he didn't know more than this. Perhaps he didn't want to offend his new royal patron, Henry VII, by drawing attention to the shameful way in which the previous king's remains had been treated. Other very early sources also skate over how the body was dealt with. On the 1st of March 1486, just over 6 months after Bosworth, the Spanish writer and political commentator Diego de Valera wrote to King Ferdinand of Aragon and his wife, Queen Isabella of Castile, that Henry VII had, quote, ordered the dead king to be placed in a little hermitage, which is literally the home of a hermit, near the place of battle, and had him covered from the waist downward with a black rag of poor quality, ordering him to be exposed there 3 days to the universal gaze. This is interesting because, like Roos, it's an almost contemporary account. However, unlike Roos, de Valera was not living in England. He was in Puerto de Santa Maria. This means he was reliant on third-hand reports and gives his source as some merchants who had recently been in England, and who had in turn told him that their information came from a Spanish subject named Salazar. This is a serious drawback from a historian's point of view. We don't know for certain who Salazar was, where he got his information, or how good his English was, though Anthony Goodman and Agnes Mackay, writing in 1973, thought that he might have been, quote, a prominent and successful captain who had fought for Maximilian, that's Maximilian I, who had recently become king of the Romans, in the Low Countries. We should also consider that the contents of de Valera's letter indicate that he was hostile to Richard and sympathetic to Henry Tudor, and this may have coloured his reporting and made him more likely to tone down any details which reflected badly on the new king. These factors would explain why his account is close to, but does not quite tally with English records, and they are why I suspect his information is slightly inaccurate. No one else mentions a hermitage. Remember, even Henry said the body was taken to Leicester, and no one else says Richard's modesty was spared by being partially clothed, even if only with a rag of poor quality. In fact, several writers say the exact opposite. A poem called Bosworth Field, likely written within a decade of Richard's death, tells us that he was brought to Newark, quote, as naked as he born might be, before being put on view. Newark, by the way, which you can see on this medieval map, means Leicester's Liberty of the Newark, according to Philip Schweizer, whose book Shakespeare and the Remains of Richard III has an excellent chapter on Richard's body. I've left it linked below for you and also added it to the Wars of the Roses idea list on my Amazon storefront if you want to check it out. The English-authored Crowland Chronicle, which had various authors but which is a near-contemporary source for the events of 1485, described Richard's death and the immediate aftermath as follows. Glorious victory was granted by heaven to the said Earl of Richmond, now sole king, together with the crown of exceeding value which King Richard had previously worn on his head. For while fighting, and not in the act of flight, this said King Richard was pierced with numerous deadly wounds, and fell in the field like a brave and most valiant prince. Through this battle peace was obtained for the entire kingdom, and the body of the said King Richard being found amongst the dead, and then there's a gap in the source before it carries on by saying, many other insults were also heaped upon it, and, not exactly in accordance with the laws of humanity, a halter being thrown around the neck, it was carried to Leicester. Crowland doesn't specify that the body was naked, but Italian writer Polydore Vergil does. He came to England in 1502, and having started in around 1506, had completed a first draft of his Historia Angliae by 1513, though it wasn't published until 1534. He said that Richard's naked body was slung over a horse, its head, arms and legs dangling, and was brought to the Franciscan monastery at Leicester, a sorry spectacle, but a sight worthy of the man's life, and there it was given burial 2 days later, without any funeral ceremony. Now, Virgil wasn't in England when Richard died, but he was there less than 20 years later, well within living memory of what had happened, and with plenty of people to ask about the details. The level of detail in his account of the battle suggests that he did indeed speak to eyewitnesses about the events of August 1485, and though he was likely patronised by Henry VII, so biased in the king's favour, at the same time he was prepared to compliment Richard when he saw fit, and despite insulting his appearance, said that his spirit was lively and fierce, and did not fail him even in death. His account of the body's treatment is also corroborated by the English writer Robert Fabian, who wrote the New Chronicles of England and France. He died in 1513, so it was evidently completed before that, and he said of Bosworth that King Richard was there slain. Then was the corpse of Richard late king, spoiled and naked as he was born, cast behind a man, and so carried unreverently overthwaite the horseback unto the friars at Leicester, where after a season that he had lain, that all men might behold him, he was there with little reverence buried. The image of a naked, mutilated corpse, attacked by those who saw it and put on display for several days until it presumably began to rot to such an extent that it was becoming unrecognisable and smelt terrible, reappears in later Tudor works too. Thomas More, who was one of Henry VIII's most famous ministers, wrote a history of Richard between around 1513 and 1518, though it wasn't published until the reigns of Edward VI and Mary I. However, when it came to Richard's corpse, he heavily plagiarised Virgil's work, which he had presumably seen a manuscript copy of, so there's no point reading out a quote. Edward Hall, who lived between 1497 and 1547, also wrote a book generally known as Hall's Chronicle, which was actually completed by another author and published after Hall's death. In it, he recorded that The dead corpse of King Richard was as shamefully carried to the town of Leicester as he gorgeously the day before, with pomp and pride, departed out of the same town. For his body was naked and despoiled to the skin, and nothing left about him, not so much as a clout to cover his privy members. And he was trussed behind a pursuivant of arms called blanche sangliere, or white boar, like a hog or a calf, the head and arms hanging on the one side of the horse and the legs on the other side, and all by sprinkled with mire and blood, was brought to the Grey Friars church within the town, and there lay like a miserable spectacle. But surely, considering his mischievous acts and facinerous doings — facinerous is an archaic word meaning wicked — men may worthily wonder at such a caitiff. Another archaic word, caitiff, means contemptible or cowardly. And in the said church he was with no less funeral pomp and solemnity interred than he would to be done at the burying of his innocent nephews, whom he caused cruelly to be murdered and unnaturally to be quelled. As he wasn't born until over a decade after Bosworth, Hall used the works of others for details of events which occurred outside his living memory, and may have had access to oral history traditions too. He certainly used the likes of Virgil and Moore — this was the first time parts of Moore's work were published, in fact — but Peter Herman, writing in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, adds that Hall also consulted unnamed sources, several of which are either lost or were private to himself. So while he wasn't a contemporary of Richard's, and his work is certainly more reliable when he is discussing the events of the 1520s and 30s, which he himself had lived through, Hall is still a good, early, secondary source for the tale of Richard's death and burial, and the fact that he doesn't say anything dramatically different to Virgil, Fabian, or any of the others indicates that his version of events was, like theirs, the accepted one in the decades after the king's death. There was no great competing narrative. That Richard's corpse was mistreated was ultimately proven in 2012 when his skeleton was found, for the pelvis and ribs showed evidence of humiliation wounds inflicted after death, and there may well have been others which left no trace on the bones. He wasn't displayed so that the body could be damaged, though. This was done to establish beyond any doubt that he was dead, and prevent rumours that he had survived of the kind that still swirl around his nephews, Edward V and the Duke of York, who were placed in the Tower of London on his orders, never to be seen again. So we've established that Richard was brutally killed on the battlefield, stripped naked, slung over a horse, and taken to Leicester, where he was displayed for 2, possibly 3 days, before being buried under the choir of the Grey Friars there, with little or no ceremony. Just to jump ahead for a moment, we also know from the discovery of his skeleton that he wasn't moved from that grave until 2012. This is because he was still laid out in perfect anatomical order, which doesn't happen when disintegrating bodies or skeletons are moved later. Anne Boleyn, for instance, was moved at least once prior to the Victorian era to make way for a new body to be buried underneath her, and when the Victorians dug her up in the 1870s, her bones were found heaped in a pile. See my video on her exhumation for more details. Richard had no grave goods interred with him, and it is extremely unlikely that he had even a wooden coffin, which has since rotted away, as his head was propped up against the end of the grave and his torso was twisted to one side, indicating that it was too short for his frame and had been hastily and poorly dug. A coffin would have allowed the body to be laid out flat and forced a grave of the proper size to be created. The archaeologists who found him also commented in an article which I'll leave details of below that a coffin's, quote, shape is usually distinguishable in the grave soil, with nails marking where coffin boards were fixed together, end quote. No such shape was found here. In any case, it's hardly plausible that there was a spare coffin lying around the friary just in case the king happened to die nearby and the new king ordered him to be buried there a few days later. Richard was probably interred in the naked state in which he had been displayed, for a shroud would have bound his limbs together in a straighter configuration than they were found. He was placed under the choir, though, which was a place of honour within the church, though it wasn't as important as other areas such as the presbytery. The grave was also very shallow, again indicating the speed at which it was constructed. The place of his burial was well known to contemporaries and appears in several of the records I have read out to you, yet it is also clear that this knowledge was not universal. The French historian and poet Bernard André came to England with or just after Henry VII, was patronised by the new king, ended up being the tutor of his eldest son Prince Arthur, and wrote an incomplete history of Henry's reign which covered the years up to 1502. Yet even with his impressive royal connections, he wasn't sure of the location of Richard's grave, and left a gap in his manuscript where this detail should have been inserted. He did say that Henry had had him buried with all respect, but as I don't think a naked burial with no coffin or ceremony shows all respect, I think we can put this comment down to André sucking up to his royal master. This gap in knowledge must have been plugged for a time though, for we know from Henry VII's chancery records that 10 years after his accession in 1495, he paid to have a monument placed over Richard's grave, advertising to all who saw it the final resting place of the defeated king. An alabaster man named Walter Hilton was to receive £50 for the job, though later records show a James Keeley being paid £10 1 shilling for it instead. As David Baldwin, writing in 1986, said though, whether Keeley was working on behalf of Hilton or whether he was a later cut-price contractor is unclear. This monument was likely destroyed at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries. The Grey Friars was suppressed in 1538, and no images of it survive. But we have some written descriptions of it, albeit none of them contemporary. Raphael Holinshed, whose Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland was first published in 1577, said that King Henry VII caused a tomb to be made and set up over the place where he was buried, in the church of the Grey Friars at Leicester, with a picture of alabaster representing his person. The Elizabethan and later Jacobean politician, royal servant and historian Sir George Buck, who died in 1622, said in the 1610s, though his book wasn't published until the 1640s, that it was of mingled colour marble. His contemporary, William Burton, wrote in his History of Leicestershire, published in 1622, that King Henry VII, out of a royal disposition, erected for him a fair alabaster monument, with his portrait cut out and placed thereon. This is all the information we get about the monument's appearance, though. I can't even tell you if the alabaster was a life-size effigy of Richard or just a picture of him cut into the marble. There was also a Latin inscription, which we have later copies and translations of. There are some slight variations in how it has been translated, but the earliest version I found reads, I here, whom the earth encloses under various coloured marble, was by many called Richard III. As protector of the country, on behalf of a nephew's inherited right, I held the British kingdoms by broken faith for just 60 days less 2. And 2 summers I wielded sceptres that were not mine. Fighting bravely in war, deservedly deserted by the English, I succumb to you, King Henry VII. But you yourself, piously, at your expense, thus honour my bones, and cause a non-king to be revered with the honour of a king. When in twice 5 years less 4, 305-year periods of our salvation have passed, this references the date the monument was constructed, and 11 days before the calends of September, a reference to the date of Bosworth, I surrendered to the Red Rose the right it was owed. Whoever you are, pray for my offences, that my punishment may be lessened by your prayers. The monument was evidently gone by the time the 16th century English writer and historian John Leland visited the area, not later than 1543. For he wrote that the Grey Friars of Leicester stood at the end of the hospital of Mr. Wigaston. Simon Montfort, as I learned, was founder there, and there was buried King Richard III. The use of the past tense to describe both the friary and the grave indicates that neither was available for viewing anymore. Still, locals knew where the building and the grave had been, and this knowledge remained for decades to come. In 1612, Dr. Christopher Wren, father of the famous architect, wrote the following in a letter. The wicked and tyrannical prince, King Richard III, being slain at Bosworth, his body was begged by the nuns at Leicester. This is the first mention of nuns I've ever seen, and I think this detail is a later fabrication, and buried in their chapel there. At the dissolution whereof, the place of his burial happened to fall into the bounds of a citizen's garden, which being after purchased by a Mr. Robert Herrick, sometime mayor of Leicester, was by him covered with a handsome stone pillar, 3 foot high, with this inscription, Here lies the body of Richard III, sometime King of England. This he showed me, Christopher Wren, walking in the garden, anno 1612. It was at almost exactly the same time, though, in 1614 to be precise, that some of the myths about Richard's grave started to appear in the published record. In that year, the writer and mapmaker John Speed wrote in his History of Great Britain that the monument was destroyed during the suppression of the monastery, and that, since then, his grave, overgrown with nettles and weeds, is very obscure and not to be found. Only the stone chest wherein his corpse lay is now made a drinking trough for horses at a common inn, and retaineth the only memory of this monarch's greatness. His body also, as tradition hath delivered, was borne out of the city, and contemptuously bestowed under the end of Bow Bridge, which giveth passage over a branch of Stora, I assume that's a misspelling of the River Soar, upon the west side of the town. Upon this bridge, the like report runneth, stood a stone of some height, against which King Richard, as he passed towards Bosworth, by chance struck his spur, and against the same stone as he was brought back, hanging by the horse side, his head was dashed and broken, as a wise woman, forsooth, had foretold, who, before Richard's going to battle, being asked of his success, said that where his spur struck, his head should be broken. But of these things, as is the report, so let be the credit. There are 2 legends here. One that Richard's stone coffin had been located and was being used as a drinking trough for animals, the other that his body had been dug up and cast into the River Soar. Neither has any basis in truth, yet both would persist until the discovery of his skeleton, despite the fact that this account, published 129 years after his death, is the first time they are mentioned in the written record. It's a sobering reminder of the importance of source analysis and not just blindly believing everything you read or which is passed down by the locals of a town. Perhaps some poor individual's bones were thrown off a bridge on the assumption that they were Richard's, and some old coffin was found during local digging work, but the idea that they belonged to Richard was just a good story to tell visitors and to encourage them to come to the inn where the trough lay. I would like to add, in Speed's defence, that he seems to have doubted these tales too. He began, after all, by saying that Richard's grave was overgrown and obscure, indicating that he did believe it still existed, and that he didn't really buy into the idea that the king had been dug up, tossed in a river, and his coffin repurposed, stories which he called traditions and reports. We know too, of course, that the grave was indeed still extant, but the knowledge of exactly where it was fading. In John Weaver's Ancient Funeral Monuments, published in 1631, he mentions that the king was buried in Leicester, but says no more about it. The diarist John Evelyn visited the area on the 9th of August 1654 and said that it was, quote, famous for the tomb of the tyrant Richard III, which is now converted to a cistern, at which, I think, cattle drink. This indicates that by tomb he actually meant the fraudulent coffin, now evidently a highlight on the tourist tour, and nothing he wrote suggests that he actually saw or heard anything of the real gravesite. In 1677, Francis Sandford's A Genealogical History of the Kings of England was published, in which he wrote, his grave being overgrown with weeds and nettles is become very obscure and not to be found. Only the stone coffin wherein his corpse lay was made a drinking trough for horses at a common inn, and retaineth the only memory of this monarch's greatness. As you can tell, he plagiarized Speed for this account. So by the late 17th century, the location of the actual grave was lost, and some fantastical local stories coming out of Leicester had taken root. It would be hundreds of years before Richard's final fate would be known once more. Fast forward to the late 20th century, and the historian David Baldwin mused in an article from 1986, details below, about the location of Richard's grave. He got pretty darn close too. Having read Christopher Wren's description of what he saw in Robert Herrick's garden back in 1612, which seems to be the last pretty solid reference to the actual interment site, he extrapolated the following. Grey Friars House, once the home of Robert Herrick, stood until the beginning of the 1870s, where the street known today as Grey Friars adjoins Friar Lane. The garden extended from the rear of the property along Grey Friars Street to the present junction with St Martin's, and incorporated land on either side. Herrick's memorial, and by extension the Friars' Church and King Richard's original monument, must have stood somewhere within these approximate boundaries, but it is difficult now to be more precise. He went on to say, royal personages were invariably buried in a place of honour, and if the church and its environs lay just to the east of New Street, it is entirely plausible that the northern end of Herrick's garden covered the foundations of the long-vanished choir. It is possible, though perhaps now unlikely, that at some point in the 21st century, an excavator may yet reveal the slight remains of this famous monarch. He was correct that it was unlikely that Richard's remains would be found, but sometimes the unlikeliest of things happen. In 2011, Miss Philippa Langley of the Richard III Society, who had already been pushing for a search for Richard for several years and undoubtedly deserves much of the credit for his eventual rediscovery, approached the University of Leicester about conducting a dig in the location thought to exist over the top of the old friary. Having looked at Baldwin's research and conducted some more of their own, which included looking at maps of the area over the centuries, the decision was made to go ahead with such a dig. Miss Langley and the Society raised some of the funds for this, while most of the rest of the money was provided by the university and the local council. The location in question was now covered by the car parks of the city's social services and a neighbouring grammar school, and in the summer of 2012 the dig began. 3 trenches were put in, and in Trench 1 was found what turned out to be the remains of King Richard III. I've already discussed with you the way in which Richard was buried, with a poorly cut grave and probably no shroud or coffin. So let's move on now to what the bones were able to tell us about the man himself. Almost the entire skeleton, bar the feet, was found. The feet had apparently been lost at some point in the past when building work was done near the remains. And first and foremost, the bones revealed that the king did indeed suffer from scoliosis, a long-held rumour made popular by the work of William Shakespeare, but not supported by any clear-cut contemporary written evidence. It would have made one shoulder sit higher than the other, and this is reflected in some paintings of him. But as those were done during the Tudor era, it had been surmised that perhaps this so-called deformity, as it would have been viewed at the time, was mere Tudor propaganda. It was not. The other most interesting information, to me at least, was details of his injuries. I've discussed some of the post-mortem injuries inflicted on his body, which included stab wounds to what I'm going to politely call his posterior, and also injuries to his face, but the skeleton showed too that the Crowland chronicler wasn't wrong when he said that the king was pierced with numerous deadly wounds at the moment of his demise. He had suffered 10 injuries at or around the time of his death, 8 of them on his head, indicating that he had lost his helmet by that point in the battle. 2 of these were at the back and base of his skull, and were so catastrophic that they would have been fatal on their own, and exposed his brain matter. The humiliation wounds would have been inflicted after his armour was removed. The fact that he was displayed for at least 2 days suggests that he was still recognisable, but the injuries reveal what a terrible state the body was in, and how horrific it must have looked to onlookers. If you want more information about the dig, including images of the skeleton, which I've avoided for copyright reasons and because YouTube doesn't like creators to show human remains, then I would again direct you to the freely available article written by some of the academics involved in the search and discovery. There's also the Channel 4 documentary about the discovery with behind-the-scenes footage of the dig and interviews with participants. Both are linked below, and you may be eligible for a 30-day free trial with Amazon Prime, which should enable you to see the documentary. The location of the remains, the scoliosis, the deceased's age, the pattern of injuries to the skeleton, carbon dating of the bones, which placed them in the correct time period and indicated the deceased ate a high-status diet during life, and a facial reconstruction of the skull, which showed a remarkable resemblance to paintings of Richard, were all highly indicative of the fact that the lost king had been found. But it was only with DNA analysis, which matched his mitochondrial DNA to a sample from descendants of his sister, Anne of York, that the firm conclusion could be reached that this was indeed Richard. All the stories about his bones being buried elsewhere, chucked in a river, or otherwise lost were false. He'd been in the same grave since August 1485. Now, of course, he was moved. First for scientific analysis, then eventually for reburial. This caused quite the controversy though, as interested parties began to squabble over where he should be interred. The University of Leicester, who were named on the Ministry of Justice licence which had been issued to exhume him, wanted to bury him in Leicester Cathedral. However, others soon stepped forward to argue that as a York and a Catholic, this Anglican church was not appropriate for him. York Minster and Westminster Abbey were suggested, though quite how anyone thought they were going to fit him into Westminster Abbey is beyond me. It's full to the gunnels and royals haven't been buried there for centuries. Also, it's now an Anglican church. A group calling itself the Plantagenet Alliance and claiming to be descendants of Richard's family said they spoke for the dead king and wanted him buried in York because this had been his stated wish. This was disputed by historians though, and it was quickly pointed out that Richard's siblings would by now have potentially millions of descendants, so this small group could hardly claim to speak for all of them, let alone for the dead king. Elizabeth II, herself a descendant of Richard's brother Edward IV, opted not to interfere or try to claim the remains. In the end, after a lot of rather undignified fighting and legal challenges, the original plan was upheld, and in March 2015 he was finally reinterred in Leicester Cathedral. The skeleton was placed in a lead casket with a rosary and medieval materials, such as a natural woolen fleece. This was then put in a wooden coffin made by one of the descendants of Richard's sister, who had provided DNA to help identify him. A televised funeral procession, which I remember seeing, saw it taken from the University of Leicester to Leicester Cathedral via the site of the Battle of Bosworth in order to mimic some of Richard's final journey. It then lay in state in the cathedral for 2 days to allow people to pay their respects, a great contrast to the last time he was laid out for public viewing in the days after his death. A service was held on the 26th of March, presided over by the Archbishop of Canterbury and attended by many of those involved in finding and identifying the remains, and some of Richard's distant family members. The Queen was represented by the then Countess of Wessex and the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester. Richard had been Duke of Gloucester, remember. The one-time King of England was then reburied in the cathedral. The following day, his new tomb, which you see here, was unveiled. The cathedral's website has this to say about its design. The starting point for the design of the tomb was the light breaking through the entrance to the tomb of Jesus, an image of Easter morning and the resurrection. The deep cut in the stone will allow light to flood through it, symbolizing that death is not the end, but that we all receive new life in Christ. The stone is broadly the shape and size of a sarcophagus, so it takes up the volume of a human being. It is tilted slightly, as if rising to meet the risen Jesus. For centuries, Christians have been buried with their feet in the east and heads in the west, ready to stand and face Jesus when he returns, usually assumed to rise again in the east, just as the sun rises in the east each morning. The cut is cross-shaped to show that this new life was won through the death of Jesus, a Christian belief which would have been fundamental to King Richard himself. If you'd like more information on his reburial, I've left a link to a news report on the procession and funeral below. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking, that's it, but there was more controversy to come. In 2022, a film entitled The Lost King was released, written by and starring Steve Coogan and Sally Hawkins. Told primarily from Philippa Langley's point of view, it depicted a semi-fictionalized recreation of the events leading up to the rediscovery of the remains and the immediate aftermath, and led to a backlash from current and former University of Leicester staff members who objected to the way in which they, their involvement in the project, and their treatment of Miss Langley had been shown. At least one even threatened legal action. The university released a statement, which I'll link below, rebutting some of the scenes shown in the movie, and noting that their offers to assist the production had been declined. They also pointed out the considerable financial contribution the institution had made to the dig and its aftermath, the fact that the supposed location of Richard's grave had been public knowledge for years, I assume this is a reference to the David Baldwin article I already discussed, and refuted the suggestion that they had sidelined Miss Langley during the process, noting that contrary to what the film showed, quote, she formed part of the team interview panel for every single press conference connected to the king. I can only give you my impressions and opinions of this controversy, which are that having watched the documentaries from 2013 and later about the discovery, I remember being taken aback at the portrayal of the academics in the movie because I thought the characters seemed almost totally divorced from the real people as I had seen them in interviews and other footage. I wasn't surprised that they were so angry at how they had been depicted, and I think this is a good example of why it's so dangerous to show real, living people on screen without their consent. Many people think that if they see something on TV or in the movies, it must be true, so I can appreciate why it would be so hurtful to find yourself portrayed not just inaccurately, but so negatively. Miss Langley got to be involved in how the movie depicted her, but most of the others did not, and it did seem very one-sided, at least to me. I do encourage you to make up your own mind, though, by watching the documentaries and the film. So that is how Richard III was lost and found, and some of the controversies which have followed him, even in death. If you'd like to support the channel, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and for more from History Calling, you can also join my Patreon site, where I share additional material, including early access to videos and mini podcasts. I'd like to say thank you as always to those of you who already support me there, and/or by making one-off donations using the thanks button underneath videos. Let me know in the comments below if you think Leicester Cathedral was a good place to rebury the king and why. That's all from me for now, so until next week, keep learning.